Hello, I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. That is specifically the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Thank you for watching this listener's guide. This is about a music project, a choral music project called Snewíyalh, tl'a, which means Teachings of the Water in the Squamish language. And this has been a 3.5-year exploration and collaboration between a choir and local First Nations. My name is Morna Edmondson. I'm the Artistic Director of Elektra Women's Choir, and I'm the co-curator of this project. I'm here with Dr. Jeanette Gallant, who is the creator and the co-curator of the project. This is a reconciliation project which involves a collaboration between a choir and local First Nations. It is a 28-minute music video, which is not this video. There's a link in the description below to the music video. And a new piece of choral music by composer Pat Carabray and words in the Squamish language, which are sung by the choir in Squamish, gifted to us by Rebecca Duncan. And we'll tell you much more about her as well. So in this listener's guide, we're going to talk about the teachings themselves, the teachings of the water. We're going to talk about our collaborators and how we met them. And we're going to talk about our process in putting this whole project together. So as background, most Canadians know that there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in that released a report in 2015 that gave dozens of guidelines for how we can begin to repair the wrongs done to our First Nations. And many artists are wondering how they can participate in that. What can we do to act on those recommendations? So in wondering about that, I started attending other events by other arts organizations, tried to find out what they were doing. And one of the things that I heard in one of the presentations was nothing about us without us. And that was really easy for me to remember and to hang on to. And what that told me is I can't do anything about these cultures if I'm not working with people from the cultures themselves. So at one of those events, I met Dr. Jeanette Gallant, whom you'll meet in a minute, and I asked her to help Elektra create some conversations. We called them cultural conversations, and they were about cultural appropriation, not only in a First Nations context, but any context at all, which is something that choirs are very concerned about right now. So I brought Elektra to the table with this project. I signed us up to go wherever this was going to go and to pay for the project. And I really had as my goal to make this something meaningful for my singers and for myself, of course, for anyone we collaborated with, and for anyone who watched the resulting project.
My name is Dr. Jeanette Gallant. I grew up on Secwepemc territory in BC's interior, but now live and work on Coast Salish territory in Vancouver. I'm an ethnomusicologist with a doctorate from the University of Oxford and have taught global Indigenous music traditions at various academic institutions. This project was conceived in 2016 before questions of social justice and equity became global conversations. Having lived overseas for many years, I returned to Canada as water protection gained greater public attention during the Idle No More movement that began in 2012. This is an ongoing movement that initially formed in reaction to Bill C-45, an omnibus bill that sought to bypass First Nations consultations on large construction projects. Since then, female water protectors have come to the forefront, the best known being Anishinaabe water advocate Autumn Pelletier. Just as water rights and responsibilities cannot be generalized across all First Nations, gendered relationships with water also play out differently in Inuit, First Nations, and Métis contexts, where some have specific roles, responsibilities, or spiritual relationships with water, while others do not. In coast and interior Salish communities, women do serve as water protectors, And given widespread public concern for BC's coastal waters, I thought the idea of women and water stewardship might be an excellent way to engage a women's choral group in an act of reconciliation through the arts. Elektra, I thought, would be the perfect choice. Since this project would be seen by a mostly non-Indigenous choral audience, I constructed the following framework through which First Nations water teachings could be shared by knowledge keepers: the natural world, birth, ceremony, song, and identity. This more linear learning approach was balanced by drawing on the idea of relationality, which is central to First Nations pedagogies, i.e. how knowledge is learned, and epistemologies, i.e. how knowledge is known. Relationality is the concept that we are related to each other, the natural world, and to the spiritual world, and that these relationships bring about interdependencies. The project was structured to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing that were holistic, experiential, place-based, and intergenerational, and that would allow Indigenous-led learning to occur in relationship with fellow singers, Elektra's leadership, members of the community, and local lands. My hope was that relationality would be understood not only conceptually, but as a practice through which relationships with local Indigenous people would be created, built, and maintained well beyond the scope of this choral project. Throughout this 3.5-year process, we have gone to great lengths to ensure this objective was achieved through regular consultation at every turn and every step.
About a year before the pandemic hit, Elektra hosted its first cultural conversation. We all have so many questions about what we should be singing and how we should be doing things. And in addition to Nothing About Us Without Us, I learned that one, if you're going to truly collaborate, has to be willing to let things change midstream. So it's one thing as a normal choral conducting process to plan something and know what all the details are and figure them all out and know exactly what the end result is going to be. But to do a collaboration, you have to be willing to let go a little bit of that, and the project might take a slightly different direction. So originally this was going to be, now this was all pre-pandemic, live concerts in a small venue near the water. We were going to have a ceremony by an elder at the beginning of the concert, and that was it. That was all it was going to be. And the music was going to be extant pieces that involved water. I wondered many times in the entire 3.5 years, is this the right thing to do? What right do we have to do this? So I made a lot of phone calls. I talked to a lot of patient people who helped educate me and helped direct me to other people that we might collaborate with. And I learned something from every one of those conversations. So eventually it became clear that the pandemic was not going to go away, and we decided to morph this into a video rather than live concerts. And I have learned over the years that sometimes something is a great idea, but it's not going to work right now. So it was not foreign to me to have to say, this is going to take a different timeline than we originally intended, and it's going to turn into something different than we intended. And in fact, every single time we had to rethink it, it got stronger. So what you see in this project is better for all of the time that it took. We realized that a commissioned work by an Indigenous composer was going to be a necessity for the project. And eventually we realized that that music should be the only music. And all of a sudden, when it became a video rather than a live concert, it didn't matter how long that piece of music was. So we had Patrick create it to accommodate the five concepts of the project. So that was an example of how it got stronger as we kept having to adapt. The other thing was I was torn between whether it would be a piece of Western art music or something different. I didn't want it to be a parody of First Nations music. My singers and I love digging into tricky Western art music. That's really what we do. but we didn't want this piece to be foreign to our First Nations collaborators. And so I found out about Pat Carabray. Jeanette had known about his music. I investigated his music and decided that he was the right person for this job, and it turned out to be a really, really fantastic collaboration.
Tanchi, Pat Carabray, Dishinikashun. My name is Pat Carabray. Like many Indigenous people, I was not fortunate in growing up with my family. I was scooped, adopted out, but I was lucky. I was one of the lucky ones. I grew up in a wonderful family who supported me all through my life, and I've been able to reconnect with my Métis family. So now I have a very big, wonderful, extended family. In fact, I'm going to meet my younger brother for the first time, going on holiday soon to Europe, and I'm going to meet him in Madrid. He was also adopted out, and through some very strange circumstances, he ended up growing up in Slovenia, of all places, where he still lives today. So we're going to meet for the first time after all these years, and it's a really wonderful feeling. Now, I have been well and truly colonized. Not a big surprise. I grew up not even knowing that I was Métis. In Manitoba, it was very common for Métis to be French because it was a lot safer. There had been quite a bit of violence against Métis people over the years. And so I grew up kind of not knowing my identity, and a lot of my work is actually about constructing identity, me trying to position myself with musical references and the way that I approach the music and texts that I use, and it's been a real path of discovery for me. I have a PhD in Western art music, so I'm completely in that Western tradition. I was very fortunate to have wonderful teachers, and I'm now a professor at the University of British Columbia, where I'm the director of the School of Music and the Chan Center for the Performing Arts. I moved to British Columbia in 2019, and it wasn't long after that that I connected with Morna at an event. And of course, I had known about Elektra for years through their recordings and through other commissions they've done of music by friends of mine. So it was really a happy thing when Morna and Jeanette approached me about this project. But like a couple of other projects that I've done that are really close to my heart, this is one that I really had to ask myself whether I was the right person for it. I had a couple of strikes against me in this case. I am not First Nations, I'm Métis. I'm what might be characterized as an uninvited guest on this land where we're working, and I'm a man. So the project is about water protocols of First Nations of this place. In this case, we've worked with Squamish Nation, and water protocols tend to be centered around women. Women have that traditional role in many Indigenous cultures. So in the end, I decided that it would be okay for me to play the traditional Métis role of mediator between the two cultures. My whole community has been involved in this since its beginning, working between Western culture and Indigenous culture. So it was a really great opportunity for me to dig into this idea of protocols and how we can connect people with the traditional knowledge and the traditional teachings of the land. So in the end, I agreed to write the notes, the musical pitches and the rhythmic profile to create kind of the skeleton of this piece that would then connect through Elektra and through the Indigenous people that eventually we connected with, and create a piece that is really a unique reflection of this place and the people in this place. Working with Indigenous people is very personal. It's not like the traditional Western music where you go to the store, you buy the music, you learn the music, you pay a royalty, you perform the piece. It's all very impersonal with particularly First Nations and with some Métis people, Inuit people. You're gifted the song, or you're gifted some component of it. You're involved, engaged in the teachings that are associated with the activity. So this is really an opportunity to connect and forge friendships, which was a very important part of what I got out, and I think everyone else got out of this particular project. So we were very fortunate to connect to Rebecca Duncan. Becky is a traditional language keeper of the Squamish language. And it was really through our interaction where we took the concepts that Jeanette had put together, looking at various Indigenous traditions about water protocols and water teachings. And Becky helped us to adapt those to the traditions of the Squamish Nation, to get some words that were associated with these various concepts, and then to go through the process of trying to realize that in a piece of music. So we took the music that I was writing based on these concepts in a much more abstract way, and we made it very unique and connected to all of the people involved in the project. So all of these words that she gave us relate to very traditional teachings of the water for the Squamish people.
I'm now going to talk to you about our Indigenous collaborators and how we came to be in relationship with them. I did a talk on Indigenous borrowings in Sarah Hopkins' Past Life Melodies for Elektra in 2019. Two Indigenous women joined us that evening, both of whom became integral to how our Teachings of the Water project would evolve. The first was Learning Through the Arts Métis and Inuit Programs leader Shelley McDonald, who was our talk facilitator. The second was Interior Salish elder Neketko, or Mary Jane Joe, who opened the evening with a greeting and a song. I'll begin by talking about Mary Jane Joe. Mary Jane Joe's traditional name, Neketko, includes the suffix ko, which means water, in her Inklekekpan language. I suggested to Morna that we approach Neketko to guide our Teachings of the Water project because of her role as a water protector in her culture. Little did we know that a series of relationships would unfold, all based on family connections. It turns out that Neketko's daughter, Nadia Joe, is a water scientist who also has the word ko built into her traditional name, Tliketko. She became highly valuable in helping us bridge the gap between traditional knowledge and current government water management practices. Because cultural learning in First Nations cultures is intergenerational, Neketko's grandson, Harrison, who's Nadia's son, also joined our project. After our project transitioned to a digital project and Pat Carabray was commissioned to write a 5-movement piece based on the framework I assembled, the natural world, birth, ceremony, song, and identity, we began to search for someone to provide the Squamish language text for his composition. Neketko then introduced us to her stepdaughter, Rebecca Duncan, or tl'a, who has devoted her life's work to preserving the Squamish language. Rebecca played a central role in Elektra's education, particularly in terms of how language would underscore Squamish worldviews on relationality itself. Now let's return to one of our original collaborators, Shelley McDonald. Besides being an educator, Shelley is a filmmaker and worked with me on the storyboard for the music video. As the project progressed, we asked Shelley if she would like to write a poem for movement number 3. Because she didn't have water songs in her family line, she didn't feel comfortable and suggested we contact her friend, Candace Halls Howcroft from the Squamish Nation. This led to a rich intergenerational collaboration with Candace's family, including her mother, Yeltselawit, or Faye Halls, who is a Squamish elder, Candace's daughter, Cheyenne, and Squamish elder Soplek, or Bob Baker. In Movement 3, following protocols set by Yeltselawit and Soplek, you will see excerpts of all 3 women leading Elektra in a cedar brushing ceremony while Soplek plays the drum. In this next section, I want to introduce you to Rebecca Duncan and discuss how important the Squamish language was to this project. In her own words, Rebecca describes the struggles and triumphs her people have had in preserving the Squamish language.
So I started teaching when I was 17. I was thrown into the classroom to sub for one of our main language teachers in the public schools here in North Van. And I was brought up from my late grandparents who taught me the importance of language and culture and the history, songs and dances. And so as a teenager, it meant the world to me. This was the most important thing for us to continue as Stomach people, as Coatmish. And it was pretty devastating when in my younger days there wasn't much interest in our language or culture. You know, the residential schools had a huge impact on making sure there was a halt to it. And with the ban on the potlatches and everything, all that built up. Yeah. So there was only a handful of people that really took it, you know, to heart. And those were mainly elders. So my circle of friends as a young girl to in my teens and a young adult, I spent all of those years with our language-speaking elders. And, you know, just lived and breathed it. It was the only thing I cared for. The only thing I longed for was that our people would one day see the importance of it and carry that on. And now, today, there's probably at least 2 handfuls of fluent speakers and over 100 eager learners now in our adult immersion program. So it's done a huge turnaround where I think it's probably 400% turnover in the interest, in the, you know, taking the reins, and people are actually taking it into their lives, into their souls, and living and breathing the language and culture.
In this same 2021 interview, Rebecca gave us insights into some water teachings in her culture.
Water teachings is so vital to our lives. I mean, when we begin our life, we are surrounded in water. In our mother's womb, we go through the sacred circle of water throughout our lives. We we have to have water to survive, to drink the water. We must submerge ourselves in water to cleanse ourselves, you know, the spiritual cleansing and the cleansing of our bodies, our minds, our spirits. And we must also let it go. You know, it's so important to let that water go, release that tension, that when we need to cry, it's so important to let that go. So it's a sacred circle. It's very important.
I now want to explore how the addition of the Squamish language helped teach relationality and enhance our learning. I begin with the title of Movement 1 and the words used in it. In a joint Zoom meeting between Pat Carabray, Rebecca Duncan, Morna Edmondson, and me, Rebecca explains her choice of words and their cultural meaning. Our discussion includes the challenges of choosing words for non-speakers, but as you will see in the end, finding the right expression of relationality was our primary goal.
There's also the natural world. There's 2 options. Now, I can be literal and say our entire world, which means it's like a basket that's holding all of us together. Kaksen tisiachin. Kaksen tisiachin. Or this description that you have here under the natural world, to me, that's more like a chaos.
Whoa.
And that's actually what I named my language nest. It's a really, really important word for our family. My papa taught that to us. You don't hear that word every day. It literally means how we are all connected, how we are connected to each other, to the land, to our ancestors, and, you know, to everything, meaning the waters, the lands, the everything around us, how we are connected, the medicines, everything, you know, and then to each other.
That's a word then.
Is that one word? That is not a phrase, that's one word. Can you say it again?
It's all
you'll have to do that one again.
Yeah.
Suffixes like crammed together to form one word.
Yeah.
So tl'a is pluralizing tla'in, tla'in means to touch. So tl'a means touching, and kwa is the suffix for like the head, and heos is the suffix for meaning our bodies, our lines. So it's literally how our lines are touching, how we're connected to each other, to everything, all these different,
What a great word.
Beautiful concept. Yeah.
It
Oh,
is. Yeah. So, but it's a quite the difficult word for people to say, even in our own community. Everybody's like, what?
Going back to our interview in 2021, Rebecca discusses her word choices for other movements with respect to relationality. This is what she had to say about movement number 2, birth.
Birth. This is one of our very first ceremonies that we celebrate for this particular human being. Quis nahue, when you were born. It literally means when you appeared or when you first showed yourself. And so we honor these babies. Every year we hold a sacred ceremony to honor all the babies that were born that entire year. And, you know, it's important for us because it gives not only acknowledgement of welcoming into our community and embracing that baby, but the protection that goes along with it, that you're one of us, you're now, you know, protected by all these teachings that will come into that baby's life. So the beginning is the most important.
For movement number 3, she shared how cedar trees reflect relationality in her culture.
Huepe'an, Papa told me that this is literally a spiritual cleansing equivalent to shokum, when you submerge yourself underwater and you let the water take all that heaviness, sorrow, anger, whatever might be weighing you down, the water will take it away. With Huepe'an, we use the cedar boughs, and we always take from where the sun has shone on it throughout the day, either the east side or the south side, for the good energy, the light. And, you know, this has been practiced throughout the entire world. Huepe'an, back east, they do the smudging. The exact same purpose, a spiritual cleansing, and that's we call Huepe'an. We use the cedar boughs, and, you know, we take all that off of us through the cedar trees. So the cedar is just extraordinarily one of the best gifts bestowed on us as Stonewall people. It not only cleanses us, but it builds our community, our tools, our longhouses, canoes, you know, baskets, clothing, everything. So the importance of the cedar tree is so, the magnitude of it all, and it also lets us, you know, be grounded again and brushes us off. So that's what Huepe'an literally means, is brushing ourselves off, a spiritual cleansing, if you will. Yes.
For movement 4, she describes the relationship between song and water.
So we each have our own song, you know, we each, through our lives, whatever our specialty is, whatever our direction in our lives, we all have a song, and it depends how we carry ourselves, how pure, how true we are to ourselves and to our people and to our history, where the land that we come from. If we can be true to ourselves and conduct ourselves in a proper way, then we are eligible, or how do you say, like almost eligible to receive a song. So it's up to us to have an open mind, open heart, and live by these teachings so that we may be able to hear these songs that are flowing in the winds. So water has much power. It can, you know, it can soothe you, it can ground you, it can purify you, cleanse you, it can wake you up. You know, there's so many different purposes that come from the power of water. So a lot of the energy bursts out from the water where these songs will catch through the wind.
Finally, in our joint meeting between Pat, Morna, Rebecca, and me, Rebecca explains relationality with respect to the word she chose for movement number 5.
Now, identity, I'm having a little bit of a struggle with because there's just so much, you know, it's so specific on which kind of identity, you know, our language is really, really specific. So, you know, when I identify myself in the language, I'll say, tl'a Asla'an Ohomech. I come from the village of Asla'an. Tina Chan is I come from.
Okay.
But
The sort of idea we were hoping for here is like we're like a drop in the ocean.
a ripple, yes.
A ripple.
So
right.
that's a fun word.
Okay.
You guys are going to like this one.
Okay.
It's me-me-yam.
Me.
Me-me-yam.
Oh, me-yam.
Yeah. When you asked about the ripple word, you know, how we can, I thought of tl'a. It's like everything is a ripple, which could apply to everything and anything.
From this same joint Zoom meeting, I would like to share 2 excerpts from our discussion about the Squamish language. The first is about language protocols, and the second is about whether or not language can be changed within a composition. What are you thinking, Pat? Like, does anything come to mind there for you?
No, I guess so where I'm still working in my head is that when I've heard local drum groups sing, they're not usually using words, right? They're usually using just the syllable that everybody can sing on. It's like how we would do fa la la in European music, you know? So I'm trying to decide where the language words would fit best, whether it's better to do the singing more without specific words and have the words articulated somewhere in the piece, whether the whole group speaks the word or whether the word is played over top or spoken over top by someone else, or whether you can deconstruct the word and use syllables from it. So I'm open at this point, you know, to figuring out what plus I want to ask, like, is it okay for us to use the words? What is the tradition in terms of getting permission to?
Oh, yes.
Protocol.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With me helping you, that is your permission.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Great.
Auntie, who is our language guru, she specifically told everybody that when you're applying language into a song, the owner of that song has every right to change it or put it into like a chant instead of like you're slurring the word. You don't have to pronounce every single thing about it. And that becomes their own. It's very, very sacred and it's very, very acceptable. So if it was like in your choir and, you know, to fit the melody or something, you know, you can maybe skip a vowel or just make it more lighter. So it's more of a slur or chant instead of, you know, you know, like you don't have to, it could be or, you know, very lightly, you know what I mean? Like skipping a rock over the water, you know, where you're
Lovely. Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing for me, is that I'm hoping that this piece, and already I can see it's working, right? It connects people, you know, so that we have this project that hopefully in the end will represent the coming together of all of us to try and say something good.
The more we got into this project, the more we realized there was such a depth of knowledge that we wanted to share with anyone who was going to view it. So we have the music video, which is 28 minutes long. That involves First Nations collaborators talking about each of the 5 concepts before we sing each of the 5 movements. There's also a 17-minute language instruction video, which is taken from the Zoom meeting we had with Rebecca Duncan and the singers of Elektra, in which they're learning the words. And in that, we kept in all of her cultural references to the words. So it's not just a pronunciation guide, it's really a cultural guide as well. And then there's this listener's guide where we're giving you as much background information as we can. It was very important to us that the whole project unfold in the right way in terms of introducing the singers to it. So we had a Zoom with Elder Niketko, who was the first person we had talked to about doing this project and the person who really guided us in the water teachings. She came on and met all of the Elektra singers on Zoom, and Pat Carberry was also there to tell his story about being a 60s scoop Métis composer and his process of discovery in doing this piece of music. We were filming during a pandemic, so we had to think about COVID safety, especially for the elders. And so what we decided on was that in the actual video footage of teachings happening, we would just involve a handful of Elektra singers. So those were the lucky ones in each of the situations who got to be right there, participate in the teaching, and ask questions. We also had to find filming sites that weren't underwater at the right time of year, and there were all kinds of things. The filming itself was over a 6-month period as we went to different sites. And the audio was recorded at Pacific Spirit United Church, which is where Elektra does all of its CDs and many of its concerts.
The process of creating a storyboard became very important to how Elektra's audience could better understand the concept of relationality through visual representations. Shelley MacDonald and I worked together to identify the types of shots we wanted to get on all 5 of our video shoots, and then worked on how each movement would take shape based on the footage acquired and what our Indigenous partners were teaching. In Movement 1, the idea was to show that everything is connected in the natural world, and we are dependent on water for life. For instance, water nourishes the land, and the land gives us medicine. Rivers and creeks are like Mother Earth's veins. They carry the water to the heart of the earth and nurture the plants and animals that give us life. Themes used were circles, rivers, lakes, the ocean, and animals or creatures. To give you a deeper dive into how relationality plays out in the storyboard images, here are a few images from Movement 1, all of which focus on the idea of the circle. Here is a waterfall falling into a circle in the ice. Next is a circular mountain lake. Then Elektra forming a circle around the natural circular shape of the land. Next is the circular shape of the cedar basket, also the name of Movement 1, tl'a. Then the birds flying in a circle above the ocean. Then an overhead shot of Elektra in 2 circles around a circular tuft of grass in the land. Here's a closer shot of the same. And finally, the spiral shape on the shell of this crustacean. The title of Movement 2, Snewíyalh, conveys the belief that birth is sacred because we all come from the amniotic fluid found in our mother's womb. In this movement, we parallel the idea of human birth with new growth in spring. This was achieved by highlighting the hydrological water cycle going from snow falling to ice melting to the spring runoff and waterfalls to sunshine and new growth. In Movement 3, we see Elektra singers preparing for ceremony, as well as snippets of the cedar brushing ceremony performed by a male drummer and 3 women. To depict how water is used to heal or wash away pain and trauma, you will see 3 women dipping cedar branches in water, brushing Elektra singers with them, throwing the cedar branches into a moving river, and the cedar branches being swept away. Because parts of the water ceremony are sacred, elders Yetzelowit and Saplek advise us on protocols. While the full ceremony was experienced by Elektra singers off camera, only segments of the ceremony were reenacted for the video, and no music was ever recorded. Traditionally, family members owned water songs, and these songs were passed on to teach cultural values and beliefs. In movement number 4, we see how personal power is gained through song and how songs bring us together in relationship with each other, ourselves, and the land. Themes used were waterfalls, beautiful water sights, hands and feet in water, swimming, the water-like appearance of Elektra's shawls in the wind, and looking out at the water for strength and inspiration. In Movement 5, water not only teaches us where we come from, but that human beings are but a ripple in the natural world. Themes used were ripples in the water, a drop of paint in an artist's bowl of water, circles, relationships with one another, intergenerational family shots of our Indigenous collaborators, and our relationship to Coast Salish territory.
Most places in the world have traditional caretakers of the land, the water, the air. And so I thought that this project would be a great opportunity to develop a protocol for connecting to those caretakers and providing an opportunity that's like an invitation to connect. So we often think of a classical music score as a protocol, a set of instructions on paper to create something in sound. So in this case, I'm going one step further. I'm giving you a roadmap and some instructions to connect with the people, the traditional caretakers of the land, and to have that influence the final sound of the piece. So my hope is that choirs who do this piece will take that invitation, look at what we created here with Elektra and with Becky and the Squamish traditions, and adapt that and use that as a roadmap to connect more viscerally to the land and to the people and the teachings in your place. And get to know how water is different in your territory than in this territory. You know, and where I come from in Red River, water is often frozen. In the Lower Mainland, not so often the case here. So this idea of frozen water is not really reflected in this piece, but it could be. There's got to be ways for you to adapt that if that happens to be part of the protocols where you are. So yes, you can perform the Squamish text that we've created for this piece, but I think if you do that, you might want to go further even and to have your own version to compare that to and see how the protocols and the teachings of water in your area are different from what they are here. So there isn't a lot of text in this composition. In fact, when I wrote it, there was no text. I was mostly oohs and ahs. But when Becky shared her words and concepts with us, they were not long phrases. It's not poetry as we often have in Western music. A lot of First Nations and other Indigenous songs that I know may just repeat almost like our equivalent of fa la la. Think about the Ayaya songs of the Inuit. So in this case, we just have small, often one word or two words that relate to this particular water protocol or teaching. One example that I think about is the last movement, which uses the word memeyum, and it's all about ripples. And we talked to Becky, and she said, yeah, when you get a song and you're adapting it, the words to the song, you can repeat things or stretch things or skip over things, or they don't have to have the perfect pronunciation that you would if you were speaking it. So that gave me a little bit of permission in this case to experiment and to use this idea of memeyum, which is kind of essentially ripples, and using may, to give a real feeling of how we ripple out in the people and in the communities and the places, how we impact where we are. So I wrote most of the music, as I said, without reference to specific words. I wanted it to be neutral enough that we could adapt depending on what Becky came up with and depending on how we tried things out as the piece was written. But in the end, each place where this piece is done has the possibility of having a very unique realization of this. It's almost like going back to things that happened in Western music 300 years ago. You have a figured bass in Baroque music where you only have the top and bottom, and the middle is realized by the person in the style of the country that they were performing in. So it would be very different in each place. So this is really an invitation to go back, to have the singers and the choir and the elders to be part of that creative process to really adapt the piece. And the kind of challenges that we had as we went through this process, because I had kind of written out phrases and structures and rhythms, we used a number of words in the same piece. In the fourth movement, for example, we used lolum and slolum chit. Lolum is song and slolum chit is our song. It changes the concept. And so I really liked that idea of slolum chit. But I, in my naivete, made the assumption that you could kind of extend the chit. As we would in European music, you go chit, and you just have the front and back of the word. But as we listened through, and really it was Morna who listened very carefully and said, Pat, I don't think that works with this particular word in this context. We went back, we listened to Becky, we all went back again, and sure enough, it's very short. So that's at the end of the word, and so I had set it as a kind of cadence for a phrase, and that means that your cadence is very short, and that's not very common. So for my aesthetic, I had to really work to try and figure out how to make that happen, and we tried the half note, was too long. We tried an eighth note, I just felt it was too short. In the end, we ended up with a quarter note with a kind of little lift on it, which I thought worked very well in most of the internal structures of the piece. But then I thought for the end, you really want to have something a little more solid to end on. So we changed the text and used lolum as the last word. But it's all this process of experimenting and trying things and balancing your aesthetic with the realities of this language, which you may not be that familiar with. So we brought in a language specialist who could do the international phonetics and allow the singers to kind of see in a more abstract way the sounds, how they would be shaped in their mouths, and how that related to other languages that they have sung before. And it turned out to be a really fascinating and creative process. I enjoyed it immensely. I know a lot of composers get very angst-filled when their music is changing, but I think that's part of the wonderful nature of this particular experience. So that interaction between how we as traditionally trained Western composers interact with the world, in this case, I'm really grappling with how we interact with the Western commercial side of things. So like I said, it's not like you've gone to the store and bought a piece that you just then learn and kind of toss it off and do your thing. I need to register it so that people understand that there are royalties that should be paid, and who those go to, we're still in the process of discussing. So in the West, normally, the royalties are split 50-50 between the composer of the music and the creator of the words. So in this case, I'm clearly, sort of clearly, the creator of the pitches, and Rebecca was the one who gifted us the words, but she did that on behalf of her community as a representative of this cultural tradition. And so what do? Do we recognize Becky as the poet, or do we need to go further than that and recognize the Squamish community? And I know a number of other Indigenous composers who are struggling with this, trying to figure out how to get our Western structures, in this case SOCAN, who collects royalties for Canada, to recognize not a person, not a corporation, but a community as for their contribution to the creation of this piece. So it's one of those things that's still to be figured out. And it's a work in progress. We're walking a path together trying to figure out the right way to do these things. Then I have to figure out how to make a score so that other people can do this. How do I notate these protocols, these invitations that I'm giving to them? So we have very clearly the Elektra score is completely finished, everything's there, but I'm trying to figure out how to make a more neutral version that will allow people to play, to interact, and to try things out. So that'll probably mean changing things, and there is really, it's a new path, and it's something that I think is well worth doing. Many organizations, musical organizations in Canada, are trying to figure out how to make these connections. And this is, I think, a good example of how one can engage with the community, make that personal connection, and develop friendships, create music, and really heal each other, because I think we have a lot of healing that needs to be done in Canada. There's a lot of dark things in our past, in our relationship to the land, to the people. I must say I'm more conflicted now than I was a decade ago. I mean, the idea of Canada is still complex for me. And as a Métis person, Louis Riel brought the Métis and Manitoba into Canada. So I know that it's part of my heritage, but when he did that, bad things happened to my people. Our land was taken, promises were not kept, we were branded, run out of the country. It makes it hard, but I've been very blessed in Canada. I have a fantastic life here. I have many great friends and these new opportunities to heal and connect. And I feel very fortunate that Morna and Jeanette reached out to me, and that I agreed to walk the path with them. So I hope that more people will take these kind of opportunities and use this piece as that invitation that it's meant, to be open, to connect to new people, and to learn from these teachings.
Welcome, Nadia, and thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and where you come from? For instance, I'm particularly interested in the fact that there's a water ethic built into your culture's naming systems.
Sure, absolutely. So thank you for this opportunity to come here. It's a privilege to sit down with you and have this conversation. So I'll begin my response first in my mother's language and then followed by my father's. So tl'a, injawat nsquashli tletko. And in my father's language, Danke kakala uye kajatan ich amandaket go uye atadake uye krugata an ich. So my English name, of course, is Nadia Joe, and I'm a member of the Crow clan from the Champagne-Anajac First Nation. So my mother is in Krakatmo from the interior of BC, and my father is from southwestern Yukon, and that's essentially the community and the culture and the tradition that I grew up in. So we are a transboundary and self-governing First Nation, and our traditional territory sort of overlaps southwestern Yukon, northwestern BC, and southeastern Alaska. So I originate, of course, from a long line of storytellers, and by day, of course, my profession is working as an environmental professional. I simply work to help advance Indigenous rights and interests in strengthening environmental protections for water within their traditional territories. But by night, I moonlight with my elders and leaders and ancestors, learning from our stories and simply learning more about the stories of creation and how we come to be in our place.
It's fascinating. In an earlier conversation, we talked a little bit about place in relation to naming systems and self-understanding. Can you expand a bit more on that for us?
So all I would say is that each Indigenous culture has different understandings of how their languages and how their cultures and traditions emerge. So I think the easiest way to think about this question is to simply invite you to consider the way that I introduce myself. So I carry 2 Indigenous names, and each of these names can come with particular endowments and responsibilities. So for instance, on my mother's side, I carry my grandmother's name, Injawin Squash Tl'a. So Tl'a translates to rain falling on water. And you'll find that the suffix of that word, ko, translates to water in Inklakatmushin, which is the Inklakatma language. And you'll often find that it's affixed to the names of the women within our communities. And so within the Inklakatma naming system, the language itself signifies a unique responsibility that women have with regards to water. And then in my father's language, Tanke Kakala Uye, Kakala is my grandfather's sister's name. And so within that naming system, traditionally, this was a way to link us across generations and across our clan systems, to ensure that each one of us would be suitably endowed with both the connections that we needed in order to nurture our land and our spiritscapes. And so one of our language teachers actually teaches us that our name for the first half of our lives is a way to carry us, a way to help us grow and become better human beings. But for the next half of our lives, it's our responsibility then to carry that name and ensure that we carry out those responsibilities.
One of the things that our listeners may want to better understand is the idea of water stewardship and the role that women in your culture play in that. Can you explain water stewardship both from a Eurocentric scientific perspective and an Indigenous way of knowing, and tell us how these have influenced your journey to becoming a water scientist?
So the tl'a River is probably the source of my most enduring lessons from childhood. This is where I had the privilege as a child to spend summers with my grandparents, Harry and Jessie Jo. And like many Yukon First Nations, my grandparents lived largely off the grid. They still lived a really traditional lifestyle. So in the summer times, they would spend their summers harvesting salmon down at the village tl'a, and in the winter times, they would head to their trap lines. And I certainly wasn't their most accomplished student, but they really did try their best to instill cultural teachings from the land. And it was here that I learned to tan moose hides, to smoke and dry fish, to trap muskrats and to snare squirrels. But these weren't just bush skills that they were teaching me. What they were teaching me were, in fact, my responsibilities to my family, to my clan, and to my community. They taught me what it meant to give back and to show gratitude for what I had taken. They taught me what it meant to live within the limits of what my environment could sustain. I was never allowed to strip an area clean when I was harvesting plants or berries. And I was always expected to leave enough for the birds, for the bees, for the bears, and for berries to simply regenerate growth in the coming years. And my elders were always generous with my mistakes, but the most tangible memory of how important this river system was, this water system, the tl'a River was to our family and to our community, happened when I was about 10 years old and my grandmother caught me tossing pebbles into the creek, as children do, just innocently tossing pebbles. And my grandmother, who was the matriarch of our village and very much responsible for a lot of the cultural interventions that were required, when she saw me tossing these pebbles into the creek where my father used to install and set up our fishing traps in the summertime, it was the first and the only time that she had ever disciplined me. And that's all that it took for me to understand just how important these water systems were to our culture and to our community, and how important it was to protect these waters from any infraction, regardless of the offense or the offender. Because these waters not only sustained our communities, they shaped our cultures and our relationships to the lands, to the waters, and to each other. And so I work predominantly in the field of water management, and my path into this area of practice really came about in a request from a trusted mentor within my community, who, when I was initiating my graduate research, simply came to me and said, "We need to learn how to protect our water."
Tell us about what water teaches us about relationships. Specifically, how do relationships in the natural world inform your understanding of interpersonal relationships?
So, as an example, in the Southern Chichoni language, the grizzly bear is called Azishur, which means grandfather bear. So I grew up witnessing the Tl'a River turn red with the backs of salmon returning to spawn each summer. And within my lifetime, I've witnessed this run almost disappear completely. So Azishur, the grizzly bear, no longer visits our village in the summertime. Instead, they visit in the winter. And more, we're beginning to witness bear tracks along the open water during December, when really they should be hibernating. So the grizzlies are looking for food, and our grandfather, quite literally, is hungry. So we find ourselves at a crux in our collectively short history on this planet. Here it's the end of June on the Pacific Northwest, and we're experiencing temperatures outside above 40 degrees Celsius. Our climate is rising at an unprecedented rate, though it's not an unpredicted rate. And the current rate of industrial development is simply outpacing our collective capacity to be able to develop the necessary protections that can address these issues as they're emerging. And the laws that currently govern our activities as humans on this planet continue to overlook these immutable laws that govern nature. And this is a problem, especially for Indigenous peoples, because poor water quality, degraded aquatic habitat, or even reduced access to our water systems not only affects our ability as Indigenous peoples to harvest to feed ourselves and our communities, but it also changes the very nature of our relationships, of how we're able to relate to our lands. By effectively limiting our ability to practice our ceremonies, to show reverence to what we know is sacred. It changes our stories even, and the nature of our connection to our history and our identity as Indigenous peoples. And it, of course, limits our ability to harvest country foods and sacred medicines. And so we have an opportunity, though. We have an opportunity for Indigenous knowledge to help restore and restory our lands and our relationships. And for us to better promote ways to live with and be responsible with the earth.
How does the Indigenous notion of relationality inform your work? And how has the application of traditional knowledge changed water governance in Canada?
Sure. So I think an important distinction from an Indigenous worldview is that there's no singular starting point. There's no one center of the universe. There are many centers within a universe. And so an important part of that is simply reorienting to the relationships that are needed to be considered in creating a sustainable approach to water management. And so that can be looking at water stewardship from the lens of a river or an ecosystem. So what's needed in order to create a healthy ecosystem, a balanced ecosystem? What's needed from an Indigenous worldview in order to ensure that people can simply go to the river and practice their culture and have access to that they're not blocked from that they're not blocked from or prevented from harvesting medicines or foods. And in terms of the application of Indigenous knowledge, there's been this gradual shift that I've experienced within my own work, where as an environmental scientist, I found I was purely focusing on assessing impacts, assessing the effects through a purely technical lens, which is of course how I've been educated through a formal education. But I think the shift that's been occurring for me is recognizing that that's such a narrow way to perceive the world. And what I found was that I was simply continually responding to the constant attacks on Indigenous lands, waters, and knowledge. And what it often felt like at times was that I was simply measuring Indigenous people's erasure from our lands in these places. And so the shift that's happened for me by focusing on the application of Indigenous knowledge and where it's appropriate is simply in understanding those relationships. What matters here? What's needed in order to create and restore that balance within this space and whose voice matters. That's been one of the most important shifts for me in the application of Indigenous knowledge in water management planning.
Nadia, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us today. It's been extraordinary meeting you. It's been extraordinary learning from you. And we appreciate your involvement with this project with Elektra Women's Choir so very, very much. So thank you for coming.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So to close, again, there are 3 videos if you want to watch everything. The links to the other 2 are in the description below this one. They're all on the Elektra YouTube channel. I also invite you to write to us through the Elektra website. There's a contact us place there. So please write in with questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you. And finally, I really want to thank everyone who worked on this project, particularly Dr. Jeanette Gallant, Patrick Carabray, Rebecca Duncan, and every one of our collaborators.